The hiss of the steam engine was a dying breath in the frozen air. Clara Fairchild stepped down from the train car, her worn leather boots sinking slightly into the thin layer of snow that covered the rough-hewn planks of the platform. The cold was a physical thing, a solid wall that struck her face and chest, stealing the warmth from her lungs. She pulled her threadbare woolen coat tighter, the fabric doing little to fend off the Montana wind that sliced across the open valley. Around her, a few other passengers disembarked, burly men in buffalo coats and a stern-faced family with 3 shivering children, all of them moving with a purpose she did not feel. They belonged here, or were at least expected. She was neither. She stood alone, a small, still figure against the vast, unforgiving landscape. Her only possession was a faded carpet bag, its floral pattern a sad reminder of a different world, a world of manicured gardens and polite society in Boston. Inside were 2 dresses, a change of undergarments, a book of poetry she could not bring herself to leave behind, and the carefully folded letter that had been her last and only hope. The letter from a man named Luke Miller, a rancher. The letter that had purchased her passage west and, in a way, purchased her as well. She clutched the bag's handle until her knuckles turned white, her pride the only other thing she had brought with her, and it felt as brittle as ice. The town, if one could call it that, was little more than a single muddy street carved into the wilderness. A collection of raw timber buildings stood hunched against the wind, a general store, a saloon with swinging doors that leaked the smell of stale beer and sawdust, a livery, and a handful of other structures that looked as though they might collapse under the weight of the next heavy snow. There was no welcome here. The town of Three Forks was a place of necessity, not comfort. Then she saw him. He stood near a sturdy buckboard wagon hitched to 2 thick-coated horses, their breath pluming in the frigid air. He was just as the letter had described, and yet more so. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a presence that seemed as solid and unyielding as the mountains that loomed in the distance. He wore a heavy sheepskin coat, its collar turned up against the cold, and a dusty hat pulled low over his eyes, even from a distance. She could see the landscape of his face was not a smooth one. A pale, jagged scar cut a path from his left temple down to his jaw, a stark white line against skin weathered by sun and hardship. He was watching her, his gaze steady and unnervingly direct. Clara took a breath, the cold air burning her throat, and forced her feet to move. Each step toward him felt momentous, a step further away from the woman she had been and closer to the stranger she was becoming. As she approached, he did not smile or offer a greeting. His eyes, a startlingly clear shade of blue, assessed her from head to toe, lingering for a moment on her worn coat and the fine, educated set of her jaw. There was no warmth in his look, only a quiet, thorough evaluation, as if he were inspecting livestock. He was, she supposed, when she finally stood before him, the top of her head barely reaching his shoulder. He gave a single, curt nod. That was his only welcome. He reached out, not for her hand, but for her carpet bag, his calloused fingers easily taking the weight of it. Without a word, he turned and tossed it into the back of the wagon. Then he gestured with his head toward the wagon seat, an invitation and a command all in one. She climbed aboard, her movements stiff from the cold and the long journey, and settled herself on the hard wooden bench. He moved with an economy of motion, untying the reins and climbing up beside her, the wagon dipping under his weight. He did not look at her. He simply clucked his tongue, shook the reins, and the horses lurched forward, pulling the wagon away from the lonely train station and onto the rutted track leading out of town. The silence of the journey was a heavy blanket, thicker than the snow that dusted the world around them. Clara kept her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed forward, though she saw little of the road. Instead, her senses were filled with the man beside her, He smelled of pine smoke, leather, and the sharp, clean scent of the cold itself. He drove the horses with a steady, competent hand. His posture relaxed but alert. He seemed a part of this land, as rugged and silent as the granite cliffs that broke through the snow-covered earth. She risked a glance at him, studying his profile, the harsh line of his jaw, the faint stubble that shadowed it, the way the wind moved the strands of dark hair that escaped his hat. The scar on his face was a question she knew she could never ask. It spoke of violence, of a past as wounded as her own. He had mentioned in his letter that he had fought in the war. The war had ended years ago, but on his face, it looked as fresh as yesterday. As the miles stretched on, her initial fear began to subside, replaced by a profound sense of awe at the world unfolding around them. The journey took them away from the last vestiges of civilization and into the heart of the western wilderness. The beauty here was not gentle. It was brutal, magnificent, and utterly indifferent to the small human lives that dared to exist within it. They followed the path of a river, its surface a sheet of dark, rippled ice that captured the pale light of the late afternoon sun. Great stands of pine trees, their branches heavy with snow, marched up the sides of steep ridges, their dark green a stark contrast to the endless white. The sky above was a vast, aching blue, so wide and empty it made her feel insignificant, a tiny speck of dust in God's vast and lonely creation. There was a terrible, powerful peace in it. For the first time in months, the frantic, terrified beating of her own heart seemed to quiet, subdued by the immense, silent pulse of the land. They had been on the road for nearly 2 hours when the wagon turned off the main track and began to climb a winding path up a ridge. The horses strained, their hooves finding purchase on the frozen ground. And then, nestled in a small clearing and sheltered by a thick grove of aspen and pine, she saw it, the cabin. It was not a shack. It was built of thick, carefully notched logs, with a stone chimney that rose strong and straight against the darkening sky. It looked sturdy, built to withstand the worst the Montana winters could throw at it. But it also looked profoundly lonely, a single structure sitting on the edge of the world, with no other signs of life for miles in any direction. This was his home, her new home. A wave of desolation washed over her, so powerful it almost made her gasp. Luke pulled the horses to a halt, the squeak of the wagon wheels the only sound in the still air. He looped the reins and jumped down, his boots crunching in the snow. He walked to the back of the wagon, retrieved her bag, and then turned to face her, waiting. Clara took a moment, gathering herself, before she accepted his unspoken offer of help. She placed her hand on his forearm to steady herself as she climbed down. His arm was as hard as rock beneath his coat sleeve. The contact was brief, impersonal, but it sent a jolt through her, a startling reminder of his physical presence. He led the way to the cabin door, a thick plank of wood with a simple leather latch. He pushed it open and stepped inside, leaving her to follow. The interior was dim, the only light coming from the open door and a single, grime-covered window. The air was frigid, colder, it seemed, than the air outside. One large room served as kitchen, parlor, and bedroom. A cast-iron stove stood cold and black in one corner. A rough-hewn table with 2 chairs sat in the center. Against the far wall was a bed, a simple frame with a straw-ticked mattress and a pile of thick wool blankets. And near the stove, a small, narrow cot. Luke set her bag down on the floor beside the cot. He took off his hat, running a hand through his dark hair. And for the first time, she saw the weariness in his face. He looked at her, his blue eyes holding hers, and the silence that had defined their journey was finally broken. "The arrangement is simple," he said, his voice a low, gravelly thing, unused to making speeches. "You will cook the meals. You will keep the cabin clean. In town. You will act as my wife. You will carry my name. People will see a respectable woman in my home. That is what I have paid for." He paused, his gaze unwavering, as if to make sure she understood the weight of each word. Clara's throat was dry. She could only nod. "There will be no other duties," he continued, his tone flat and devoid of emotion. "This is a business arrangement. Miss Fairchild, a roof over your head and food in your belly in exchange for your work. This arrangement does not involve touching." The words hung in the cold air between them, stark and absolute. He had built a wall with them, a wall she had no intention of crossing. A sense of relief, sharp and unexpected, pierced through her fear. She met his gaze, lifting her chin, and summoned the last remnants of her Boston breeding, the cool composure that had been her only shield for so long. A small, brittle smile touched her lips, a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Mr. Miller," she said, her voice clearer and steadier than she felt. "You hired me to be a bride, not to be touched." For a fleeting moment, something shifted in his expression. Surprise, or perhaps a flicker of respect. Then it was gone, replaced by the same impassive mask. He nodded once more, as if sealing the pact. "Good," he said. "Then we understand each other." He turned away from her then, moving to the stove. He knelt, his large frame seeming to fill the small space, and began laying kindling inside. The practical, domestic act was so at odds with his rugged appearance that Clara found herself simply watching him, mesmerized. She took a slow breath and let it out, her own small cloud of white in the frigid room. The deal was made. The lines were drawn. She was safe, in a way. She turned her attention to her new domain, her gaze sweeping over the sparse comforts of the cabin. The single cot was to be her own island in this sea of his life. There were no curtains on the window, no pictures on the walls, no rugs on the floor, no softness, no color. The only warmth would come from the stove he was now lighting, and it was a warmth meant for survival, not comfort. While he coaxed a flame to life, she opened her carpet bag. She took out her spare dress and hung it on a wooden peg near the cot. She placed her worn book of poetry on the small crate that served as a bedside table. It was a meager attempt to claim a piece of this space for herself, to insist that Clara Fairchild, whoever she was now, still existed. The fire in the stove caught, and a welcome crackle filled the silence. A slow, creeping warmth began to push back against the chill. Luke stood and dusted off his hands. "There's salt pork in the larder, flour and beans in the sacks by the door. The well is out back. I'll see to the horses." And with that, he was gone, leaving her alone in the growing twilight. Clara stood motionless for a long time, listening to the crackle of the fire and the distant sound of his movements in the barn. Then, with a resolve that came from having no other choice, she moved toward the sacks of flour. She would cook. She would clean. She would hold up her end of the bargain. She worked with a nervous but capable energy. Her hands, once accustomed to needlepoint and piano keys, were now clumsy with the heavy iron skillet and the coarse flour sack. But she learned. She had learned to do many things in the past year. She found potatoes and onions in a root cellar beneath a trap door in the floor, and soon the smell of frying pork and onions filled the small cabin, a homey, comforting scent that felt like a lie. He returned as she was setting 2 tin plates on the table. He washed his hands and face in a basin of icy water from the well, the splashing sound loud in the quiet room. He sat down at the table without a word of thanks or praise. He ate in silence. Clara sat opposite him, barely touching her own food, her stomach a tight knot of anxiety. She found herself watching his hands as they moved from plate to mouth. They were large, the knuckles scarred and the nails short. They were the hands of a man who worked, who fought, who built and broke things. Strong hands, rough hands. But as he handled his fork and knife, there was no cruelty in them. There was a surprising gentleness, a carefulness that seemed at odds with the rest of him. She wondered what those hands had done, what they had held. When he was finished, he pushed his plate back, stood, and took his coat from the peg by the door. "I'll take the first watch," he said. and she realized he meant he would be sleeping outside, or in the barn. A guard. Against what? The cold? The wolves? Or just the suffocating proximity of a strange woman in his home? She simply nodded, and he left. Clara cleaned the plates and tidied the small cooking area. The work was a comfort. A simple set of tasks that kept her mind from spiraling into the dark places it wanted to go. When everything was done, she added another log to the stove, the one source of heat in the encroaching, deep-throated night. She changed into her nightdress behind the inadequate screen of a blanket she hung over a rope. Her cot was hard, the blanket rough against her skin. She lay down, not on the bed that was his, but here, beside the stove, a guest, an employee, a thing he had purchased. She lay on her back, staring up into the impenetrable darkness of the ceiling, listening to the wind howl outside. It was a lonely, mournful sound, the voice of the wilderness itself. Sleep would not come. The events of the day replayed in her mind, the cold, the train, the town, his face, his words. But beneath it all, another set of memories churned, a dark and toxic undertow. She closed her eyes, and they were there, waiting for her. Not a story, but fragments. A man's face, handsome and cruel, twisted in a sneer. The smell of whiskey on his breath. A shout, loud and angry, echoing in a richly decorated parlor. The sound of silk tearing. Her dress, her beautiful blue dress. The cold, hard floor against her cheek. Then later, another room. The polished wood of a witness stand. The pitiless faces of a jury. A judge. His face a mask of stern disapproval. His voice a drone of condemnation. The sharp, final crack of his gavel. A sound that had shattered her world. And then the last image. The one that had become her constant companion. A train ticket clutched in her trembling hand. A one-way passage to a place she had never heard of. A future she had not chosen. A single tear escaped and traced a cold path down her temple into her hair. She had been owned then. By her father's name. By society's expectations. And finally, by a lie that had been believed over her truth. She had been judged, condemned, and discarded. But no more. This cold, hard bargain was a different kind of prison, but it was one of her own choosing. Here, she was not Miss Fairchild of Boston. She was a cook, a cleaner, a pretense, nothing more. He had bought her presence, but he had not bought her. In the deep, silent darkness of the Montana cabin, surrounded by a wilderness that did not know her name or her past. Clara Fairchild whispered the words into the cold air, a vow to herself and to whatever God might be listening. No one owns me again. The days that followed fell into a rhythm of silence and snow. The world outside the cabin shrank, buried under a relentless, whispering fall of white that muffled all sound and erased the sharp edges of the landscape. The mountains disappeared behind a gray veil, and the sky was a low, oppressive ceiling. They were two people trapped in a bottle, the cabin their small, shared space, the blizzard the glass wall that held them in. Luke rose before dawn, his movements quiet and economical in the dim light. He would stoke the fire, pull on his heavy coat, and disappear into the pre-dawn gloom to tend to the horses and whatever other brutal chores the winter demanded. He moved through the snow with a grim determination, a solitary figure battling the elements. Clara would watch him from the window, a dark shape against the endless white, until he was swallowed by the storm. Her own days were defined by the four walls of the cabin. She kept the space immaculately clean, a small act of defiance against the wildness outside. She scrubbed the floor, washed their few dishes until the tin plates shone, and tended the fire with a devotion that bordered on religious. The stove was the warm, beating heart of their silent world, and to let it die was unthinkable. She learned the nuances of its appetite, the way a certain kind of log would burn slow and steady, the hiss it made when a stray snowflake found its way down the chimney. They moved around each other with the careful, practiced grace of strangers sharing a prison cell. Their paths rarely crossed. When he came inside, stamping the snow from his boots, she would be on the other side of the room, folding a blanket or kneading dough. Their eyes would sometimes meet for a brief, startling moment, and in those seconds, a current of unspoken tension would arc between them. Then she would look away, her heart hammering against her ribs, and focus on the task at hand. His gaze was too intense, his blue eyes too knowing. They saw more than she wanted to reveal. In the long, quiet afternoons, when the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the howl of the wind, Clara began to write. She had brought a small packet of paper and a single pen, luxuries she had guarded on her journey west. She would sit at the table, her back to the door, and pour her thoughts onto the page. They were letters addressed to no one, letters to a version of herself that no longer existed, letters to a world that had cast her out. She wrote of the snow, of its strange and terrible beauty. She described the way the pines held their burden of white, and the profound, almost frightening silence of the landscape. She wrote about the man who lived with her, this scarred and silent giant. She described the way he moved, the strength in his back as he chopped wood, the weariness in his shoulders when he came in at night. She wrote about the things she could not say, the fear that lived in her belly, the shame that was her constant companion, and the small, stubborn flicker of hope that refused to be extinguished. When a page was full, she would fold it carefully, her name never signed, and tuck it beneath the thin mattress of her cot. The growing stack of paper was a secret comfort, a testament that she was more than a cook, more than a mail-order bride. They were pieces of her soul, hidden away, proof that she was still alive inside. Weeks bled into one another. One evening, the wind had finally died down, leaving behind a world of pristine, sculpted snow under a sky full of cold, distant stars. Luke had gone to town that afternoon for supplies, a rare trip. Clara had the cabin to herself, a quiet, peaceful respite. She hummed a little as she prepared a stew, the simple domestic act a comfort. But as the hours stretched on and the sky turned a deep, bruised purple, a knot of anxiety began to tighten in her stomach. The door burst open with a sudden violence that made her drop the ladle with a clatter. Luke stumbled in, bringing a blast of frigid air and the reek of whiskey with him. He leaned heavily against the doorframe, his hat gone, his hair disheveled. A dark, angry gash was split open above his right eye, and his lower lip was swollen and bleeding. His knuckles were raw and scraped. Clara froze, her hand flying to her mouth. He straightened himself with a visible effort, his movement stiff and pained. He looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw not just pain, but a flash of wild, contained fury. "Don't ask," he growled, the words thick on his tongue. He lurched toward the water basin, shrugging out of his coat and letting it fall to the floor. He splashed icy water on his face, hissing as it hit the open cut. Her fear warred with a strange, protective instinct. He was hurt. Her promise to herself, her carefully constructed walls, seemed to crumble in the face of his raw, physical pain. She moved without thinking, taking a clean rag from a hook and dipping it into the basin. "Sit down," she said, her voice a quiet command. He turned to glower at her, as if to refuse. But something in her steady gaze must have broken through his anger. He grunted and sank heavily into one of the chairs at the table, his head bowed. She approached him cautiously, as one would a wounded animal. The smell of whiskey and blood was strong. She gently touched his chin, tilting his face up toward the lamplight. Her fingers trembled as she did so. His skin was rough with stubble, but beneath it, she could feel a surprising warmth. He flinched at her touch but did not pull away. With painstaking care, she began to clean the cut above his eye. Her touch was light, clinical, but it was still a touch. Her skin against his. The barrier they had so carefully maintained was gone, dissolved in this moment of violence and necessity. She could feel the tremor that ran through his powerful frame, a faint, almost imperceptible shiver that matched her own. Her heart pounded in her chest, a frantic bird beating against a cage. She was so close to him now she could see the flecks of gray in his dark hair, the fine lines of exhaustion etched around his eyes. He did not speak. He simply sat there, rigid and unmoving, allowing her to tend to him. When she had cleaned the wound as best she could, she found a small tin of salve in his meager medicine box and applied it gently to the cut. Her fingers brushed against his temple, and for a second, his eyes closed. It was a fleeting gesture of vulnerability, so brief she almost thought she had imagined it. When she was finished, she stepped back, the space between them rushing back in, cold and vast. "It will need stitches," she said softly. "It will heal," he replied, his voice rough. He stood, swaying slightly, and moved toward his bed without another word, without a look of thanks. He pulled off his boots and lay down on top of the covers, fully clothed, and within minutes, he was lost to a deep, troubled sleep. Clara stood by the table for a long time, her own hands trembling. She looked at the rag in her hand, now stained with his blood. It felt strangely intimate, a shared wound. She cleaned up the mess, her movements slow and deliberate, her mind racing. The wall was broken. They had touched, and the world had not ended. Later that night, long after the fire had burned down to glowing embers, she was tidying away the rags she had used. She opened a small drawer in a rough-hewn chest to put them away, and her fingers brushed against a small, rectangular object wrapped in oilcloth. Curiosity, a feeling she had suppressed for weeks, got the better of her. Her hands shaking, she drew it out. She unwrapped the oilcloth carefully. It was a photograph, a tintype in a simple wooden frame. In the faint, flickering light from the embers, she saw the image of a woman and a small child. The woman was lovely, with dark hair piled high on her head and a gentle, hopeful smile. The child, a boy of no more than 4 or 5, sat on her lap, his expression serious and old for his age. They were dressed in their Sunday best. They looked happy, loved. Clara stared at the image, her breath catching in her throat. This was his past, his secret grief, a wife and a son, the source of the deep, abiding sadness she sometimes saw in his eyes when he thought she was not looking. Both long dead. She knew instinctively. This cabin was not just a home. It was a mausoleum, a monument to a life that had been stolen from him. Her heart ached with a sudden, overwhelming empathy. She understood, in that moment, the reason for his walls, for his silence. His grief was a thing too large for words. Gently, she wrapped the photograph back in its oilcloth and placed it carefully back in the drawer, pushing it closed. She would not ask. She would never speak of it. Some pains were meant to be carried alone. The following week, a break in the weather allowed for another trip into town. The snow was packed hard on the trail, and the sun, though weak, shone with a brilliant, blinding light. Luke needed to see the blacksmith, and their supplies were running low again. The thought of facing the town filled Clara with a quiet dread. As Luke conducted his business, Clara went to the general store. The proprietor, a portly man named Mr. Henderson, gave her a curt nod as she gathered her items: flour, coffee, sugar. She felt eyes on her. She turned to see a woman standing near the fabric bolts, a woman with a face as sharp and unforgiving as the winter wind. She was tall and thin, dressed in a severe black dress. Her hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to pull the skin taut across her cheekbones. The woman approached her, her footsteps silent on the wooden floor. "You're the Miller woman," she said. It was not a question. "I am Mrs. Miller," Clara replied, forcing a polite tone. The woman's lips thinned into a semblance of a smile. "I am Mrs. Hale. My husband's ranch borders yours to the east. We are your closest neighbors." She said the word neighbors as if it were an accusation. "I make it my business to know who lives near me." Her eyes, small and dark, raked over Clara, taking in her simple dress, her worn coat, her carefully neutral expression. "The mail brings more than just packages, Mrs. Miller. It brings news. Letters from back east travel fast, faster than a woman's reputation. It seems." Clara's blood ran cold. "We are a God-fearing community here, Mrs." Hale continued, her voice low and venomous. "We value decency. We do not forget pasts in this town, and I remember hearing tales of yours." Clara stood frozen, her hand clutching a sack of coffee so tightly the beans threatened to burst through the cloth. She could not speak, could not breathe. "Mrs." Hale held her gaze for another long moment, a look of grim satisfaction on her face, before turning on her heel and sweeping out of the store. The encounter left Clara shaken, her carefully constructed composure shattered. The whispers had followed her all the way to Montana. There was no escaping the past. It had longer legs than she did. Worse was to come. As she stood at the counter waiting for Mr. Henderson to tally her purchases, the store clerk, a young man with sly eyes and a greasy smile, leaned toward her. "Anything else I can get for you, ma'am?" he asked, his voice oozing with false familiarity. He let his gaze drop pointedly to the neckline of her dress. "Heard you Boston ladies have a taste for things a man cannot buy over a counter." The lewdness of his comment struck her like a physical blow. A hot, shameful blush crept up her neck. At that moment, Luke entered the store, his presence instantly filling the space. He saw her face, the clerk's smirk. He knew. Something dangerous flickered in his eyes, a momentary tightening of his jaw, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. He walked to the counter, placed a handful of coins down to cover their purchases, and looked at the clerk with cold indifference. He said nothing. He did not defend her. He did not even acknowledge the insult. He simply gathered their supplies and said, "Let's go." The ride back to the cabin was a new kind of silent torture. It was not the companionable silence of two people coexisting, but a thick, curdling silence of unspoken anger and bitter disappointment. Clara stared straight ahead, her body rigid. The clerk's words and Mrs. Hale's warning echoing in her mind. But louder than their voices was Luke's silence. His public refusal to stand for her had felt like a second, deeper humiliation. She was his wife in name, an object he had paid for, and he had just demonstrated how little that name was worth protecting. As soon as they were inside the cabin and the door was shut, the storm broke. "Why did you not say anything?" she demanded, her voice shaking with a fury she could no longer contain. She whirled to face him, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. He set the sacks down on the table, his back to her. There was nothing to say. "Nothing to say?" she cried, her voice rising. "That man insulted me. He insulted your wife. That woman, they are talking about me, whispering about me, and you did nothing. You just stood there and let them—" He turned slowly to face her, his expression hard, his face a mask of stone. "I paid for a wife to bring respectability to my home, to avoid trouble, not to bring it with you from Boston." The cruelty of his words stole the air from her lungs. He saw her not as a person, but as a transaction, a faulty piece of merchandise that had come with unforeseen complications. All her efforts to be useful, to be quiet, to hold up her end of their cold bargain. It meant nothing. To him, she was just the trouble she had fled. Something inside her snapped. The fear, the shame, the loneliness, the humiliation. It all coalesced into a single, white-hot point of rage. Without thinking, she strode across the floor and slapped him hard across the face, the sound of it like a gunshot in the small cabin. He did not flinch. He did not move. He simply stood there, the red mark of her hand blooming on his scarred cheek. His blue eyes bored into hers, and in their depths, she saw not anger, but a fierce, blazing intensity that terrified her. It was the look of a man holding back a cataclysm. The sight of his stillness, his terrifying control, broke her. The fire of her anger dissolved into a flood of despair. A great, shuddering sob escaped her, and then another. She covered her face with her hands, her body shaking with the force of her weeping, the tears she had held back for months, for a year, finally came. A torrent of grief for the life she had lost, the woman she had been, and the hopeless, desolate future that stretched before her. He did not move to comfort her. He did not speak a word. He just stared, his gaze fixed on her, silent and fierce, as her world fell apart at his feet. That night, she cried herself into an exhausted sleep on her cot. She woke hours later to a deep, rhythmic thudding sound from outside. She rose and went to the window, wiping the condensation from the cold glass. In the stark, blue-white light of the moon on the snow, she saw him. He was out by the corral, mending a section of the fence, though it was not broken. He was bareheaded and without his coat, dressed only in his shirt despite the freezing wind that whipped around him. He worked with a relentless, punishing rhythm. He would lift the heavy mallet high above his head and bring it down with a powerful, violent crack, driving a new post into the frozen earth, over and over again. The sound of the impact echoed in the frigid air. He was not just mending a fence, he was fighting something, channeling his own silent, terrible rage into the wood and the unyielding ground. She watched until her own hands grew numb from the cold of the window pane, watched as he worked until his hands had to be raw and bleeding. It was his only apology, his only confession, and in the lonely, brutal landscape of their lives, it was the only language they had. The slap and the storm of tears that followed changed the air in the cabin. The silence that returned was different. It was no longer a void, an absence of words, but a heavy, charged space filled with the things that had been said and done. The wall between them, once made of cold, hard contract, was now cracked, and through the fissures crept a fragile, uncertain awareness of each other. He had seen her fury and her despair. She had seen his brutal, silent penance in the moonlight. They were no longer just a rancher and his hired bride. They were two wounded animals who had circled each other and finally, clumsily, shown their teeth and their soft underbellies. Then the weather, which had been merely cruel, turned malevolent. The sky, which had been a flat, indifferent gray, darkened to the color of a bruise. The wind ceased its lonely howling and began to shriek, a physical force that battered the sturdy log walls and rattled the single window in its frame. The snow no longer fell in delicate, whispering flakes. It came in a blinding, horizontal torrent, a white roar that erased the world. The mountains, the trees, the very ground 10 feet from the door, it all vanished into the maelstrom. The blizzard had them in its teeth, and it did not intend to let go. For days, they were prisoners. The world shrank to the dimensions of the single room, its boundaries defined by the reach of the heat from the stove. Time lost its meaning, measured not in sunrises and sunsets, which were invisible, but in the simple, repetitive tasks of survival. Chopping the wood he had stacked inside, fetching water in a bucket that was half frozen by the time it reached the cabin, cooking meals from their dwindling supplies, and, above all, feeding the fire. The forced proximity was a crucible. The careful choreography of avoidance was no longer possible. They were always in each other's sight, the small space a constant reminder of the other's presence, the scrape of his chair, the soft thump of her mending basket, the way he breathed in his sleep. These small sounds became the entire symphony of their existence. And slowly, tentatively, the heavy silence began to give way. It started not with a conversation, but with a question, a simple, practical thing. "Do you think the roof will hold?" Clara asked one afternoon, her voice small against the deafening howl of the wind. She was staring up at the ceiling, where a fine dusting of snow was sifting through an invisible crack. Luke followed her gaze. He was sitting at the table, methodically cleaning his rifle, the metallic clicks of his work a counterpoint to the storm. "It will hold," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I built it to hold." There was a quiet pride in his words, the simple statement of a man who trusted the work of his own hands. She nodded, accepting his certainty, and the silence returned. But it was a little lighter now. A single thread of communication had been woven across the void. A day later, another thread. He was staring into the flames of the stove, his face illuminated by the flickering orange light, his expression distant and shadowed. "You are not from a place like this," he stated, his eyes still on the fire. It was not a question. Clara was kneading dough for bread, her hands dusted with flour. "No," she said softly. "I am from Boston." "Boston." He repeated the word as if it were a foreign language. "What would a woman from Boston want with Montana?" Her hands stilled in the dough. Here it was, the question that lay between them. She could lie, could invent a story of adventure or family, but the rawness of the storm outside, the sheer, stripped-down reality of their existence, made lies feel frivolous and weak. She took a breath. "I had reasons to leave," she said, choosing her words with care. "A disagreement with a powerful family." He turned his head then, his blue eyes finally meeting hers. He waited. He did not press, but his silence was an invitation. And so, in fragments, over the course of the next 2 days, the story came out. She told him of a man, the son of a prominent judge, who had taken an interest in her. She spoke of his advances, at first charming, then insistent, then frightening. She did not describe the final, violent encounter in the parlor, the torn dress, the terror. She could not bring herself to give voice to that, but she spoke of the aftermath. "He told everyone I had led him on," she whispered, her gaze fixed on her flour-dusted hands. "That I had a loose character. His father, the judge, he believed him. Everyone believed him. They held a hearing, not a real trial, but a hearing to determine my moral fitness. It was a humiliation." Her voice was flat, devoid of self-pity, the voice of someone recounting a history that had happened to someone else. "My father was a good man, but he was a merchant. We did not have their name, their power. In the end, my reputation was ruined. There was no place for me in Boston. The advertisement for a wife. It was a way out, the only way out." Luke listened without interruption. His face was impassive, a mask carved from Western granite, but his eyes never left hers. He absorbed her words, her shame, her quiet, desperate story of injustice. When she fell silent, the only sounds were the fire and the wind. He did not offer platitudes or sympathy. He simply nodded, a slow, deliberate gesture of understanding. He had heard her, and in his quiet acceptance, she felt a sliver of her burden lift. The next evening, it was his turn. She was mending one of his shirts by the firelight, the simple, rhythmic motion of the needle a comfort. She noticed the fabric was puckered and strangely thick over the left shoulder. "You have mended this before," she said, her fingers tracing the clumsy, thick stitches. "A long time ago." "That is not a mend," he said, his voice quiet from across the room. "That is where the bullet went in." She looked up. Startled, he was watching her, his expression unreadable. "The war," he said, answering her unspoken question. "It is still in there. The doctor said it was safer to leave it." He shifted his shoulder, a small, unconscious movement of remembered pain. "My brother, Thomas, he signed up with me. He was younger, full of fire, thought it was a grand adventure." Luke's voice grew rough, losing its flat edge and taking on a raw, gravelly texture. "He died at Cold Harbor. Never saw his 20th birthday. I was there. I held him." He fell silent, his gaze lost in a past she could not imagine. He was not in the cabin anymore. He was on a battlefield, surrounded by smoke and death. When the war was over, he continued, his voice barely a whisper. I came home, but it was not a home anymore. My parents were gone. The farm was empty. The silence was louder than the cannons had been. So I sold it and came west. Thought I could outrun it. He gave a short, bitter laugh that held no humor. You cannot outrun a thing like that. It travels with you. Now she understood. The cabin was not just a monument to a dead wife and child. It was a fortress he had built against the ghosts of his entire life. The war, his brother, the home that never healed. His wounds were as deep and as invisible as her own. They sat in silence for a long time, the firelight dancing on their faces. The storm outside seemed to have quieted, its fury spent, replaced by a deep and profound stillness. Their shared pain was a tangible thing in the room, a third presence that connected them more surely than any touch. She finished her mending, tying off the thread with a neat knot. She looked at him, at his broad shoulders slumped in weariness, at the harsh lines of grief etched on his face. She thought of his solitary life, the immense weight of the sorrows he carried alone. You think you are alone in your grief, she said, her voice soft but clear in the quiet room. You are not. His head came up, and his eyes met hers across the flickering space. For the first time, she did not see a stranger, a captor, or a business partner. She saw a man, as broken and as lonely as herself. And in his eyes, she saw a flicker of the same recognition. The blizzard broke the next morning. They awoke to a world transformed, silent and blindingly white under a pale, washed-out sun. The air was clean and cold, the fury of the storm replaced by a profound, crystalline peace. Luke dug a path to the barn, his movements slow and deliberate. The truce born of the storm held. They spoke little, but the silence was comfortable now, easy. The following day, he hitched the horses to the wagon. I am going to town, he said. It was a statement, not a request for permission. We need nothing, she replied. I am going to town, he repeated. His jaw set. He met her eyes, and she saw a flicker of the same cold fire she had seen the night she had slapped him. But this time, it was not directed at her. She nodded and watched him go, a strange sense of foreboding and anticipation settling in her stomach. He was gone for most of the day. When he returned, there was a fresh bruise high on his cheekbone, and his knuckles were scraped raw, just as they had been after the bar brawl. He said nothing of his trip, simply unhitching the horses and starting his evening chores. But word travels fast in a small town, even a town buried in snow. The next time they went for supplies together, the atmosphere was different. People stared. They whispered behind their hands. Mrs. Hale saw them from across the street and turned her back pointedly. It was Mr. Henderson at the general store who gave them the story, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and relish. Heard you had some trouble. Miller, he said, keeping a respectable distance. That young clerk, Jimmy, he will not be making any more smart comments for a while, not with a broken nose and 2 missing teeth. Clara looked at Luke. He was staring at a display of axe handles, his expression utterly blank. He had gone to town and found the clerk. He had not used words. He had used his fists. He had defended her. Not in the moment, not when it might have mattered to her pride, but later, in his own time, in his own brutal way. A cold, hard knot of something she could not name tightened in her chest. His actions, however, had also solidified her reputation. She was no longer just the woman with the questionable past. She was the woman whose husband broke other men's noses. The whispers grew louder. The stares grew colder. But something had changed in Clara. The shame that had been her constant companion for so long was beginning to feel less like a shroud and more like an ill-fitting coat, something she could choose to cast off. She had survived Boston. She had survived the journey west. She had survived the blizzard. She was a survivor, and survivors did not cower. The next Sunday, they encountered the preacher and his wife on the main street. The preacher gave Luke a stiff, disapproving nod. His wife, a woman whose face seemed perpetually puckered with judgment, looked directly at Clara. "A woman's place is to walk in meekness and humility," the preacher's wife said, her voice loud enough for several passers-by to hear. "She should be a crown to her husband, not a millstone of trouble around his neck." Before Luke could even react, Clara stepped forward. She did not raise her voice. She did not flush with anger. She met the woman's gaze with a cool, steady calm. "And a Christian's place, madam," Clara replied, her Boston accent clear and precise, "is to show charity and refrain from judgment, lest they be judged themselves. I believe that is in the same book you profess to follow." She held the woman's gaze for a moment longer, then gave a slight, polite nod. "Good day to you." She turned and walked away, her back straight, her head held high. She did not walk behind Luke like a bought woman. She walked beside him. He caught up to her in 2 long strides, grabbing her arm gently to stop her. He stared down at her, and his face was a study in utter astonishment. He was seeing her for the first time, not the quiet, fearful creature who had stepped off the train, but a woman of fire and steel, a woman who could defend herself with words as sharp as any knife. She was no longer quiet. She was no longer meek. And the look in his eyes was something she had never seen before, a deep, grudging, and profound respect. That night, the fragile peace between them deepened into something else, something terrifying and hopeful. He found her by the stove. The fire burned down to glowing embers. The cabin cast in flickering shadows. She was not crying loudly, but he could see the silent tears tracking paths down her face in the dim light. He stood before her, a looming, uncertain shape in the darkness. "What is it?" he asked, his voice rough with a concern he could not hide. She looked up at him, her eyes luminous with unshed tears. She took a shuddering breath, the words coming out in a raw, broken whisper. "When I first came here, I told you I did not want to be touched." Her voice cracked. "I lied." The confession hung in the air between them, a truth so raw and vulnerable, it seemed to suck the very breath from the room. It was an admission of need, of loneliness, of a deep and aching hunger for simple human contact. It was the bravest thing she had ever said. Slowly, hesitantly, as if she were reaching for a flame, she lifted her hand. She reached for his. He stood frozen for a heart-stopping second, and she thought he would pull away, retreat back behind his walls, but he did not. His large, calloused hand closed around hers, enveloping it in a rough, surprising warmth. A tremor went through her, a tremor he answered with one of his own. Her gaze dropped from his face to the front of his shirt. With her free hand, she reached out and her fingers fumbled with the top button. Then the next. Her movements were slow, deliberate. He stood perfectly still, a statue allowing himself to be undone. She pushed the rough fabric of his shirt aside, revealing the scarred landscape of his chest. She saw the pale, puckered skin of old wounds from the war, and the darker, angrier mark on his shoulder where the bullet still lay. These were the marks of his pain, the physical record of his grief. And she was not afraid. She did not press her body to his. She did not kiss him. She simply laid her head against his chest, her cheek pressed against the warmth of his skin. She wrapped her arms around his waist, holding on as if he were the only solid thing in a spinning world. After a long moment, his own arms came up, circling her, pulling her close. He took one of the thick wool blankets from his bed and draped it over both of them, a shield against the cold and the darkness. And there they stood, in the heart of the vast, lonely wilderness, fully clothed, holding each other under a single blanket, simply trembling in a shared, life-giving warmth. The world began to thaw. It was not a gentle process. It was a slow, messy, agonizing birth. The great mountains of snow that had buried the land for months began to weep, their tears carving muddy channels in the white. The constant, oppressive silence of winter was replaced by a symphony of dripping water from the eaves of the cabin, from the laden branches of the pines, from the colossal icicles that had formed on the cliff faces. The air, once sharp and sterile, now carried the rich, damp scent of thawing earth, of pine needles, of life stirring in its sleep. The change in the world outside was mirrored by a change within the cabin's walls. The fragile warmth that had been kindled between Clara and Luke during the blizzard did not vanish with the snow. It settled, deepened, became a quiet, constant presence. The careful boundaries they had once observed eroded like the snowbanks outside. A casual brush of his arm against hers as they passed by the stove no longer sent a jolt of alarm through her, but a soft, spreading warmth. She no longer averted her eyes when she found him looking at her. Instead, she would meet his gaze, and sometimes a small, genuine smile would touch her lips. He began to speak more, not in long conversations, but in small observations offered up like rare gifts. He would point out the tracks of a deer in the new mud, or the first brave buds on an aspen tree. He told her the names of the mountains that were slowly re-emerging from the clouds. The Crazies, the Galatins. He spoke their names with a quiet reverence, as if they were old and respected friends. She, in turn, shared pieces of her own world. She read to him sometimes in the evenings from her book of poetry, her voice soft in the firelight. At first he seemed merely tolerant, but she soon noticed he would grow still, his hands quiet, his gaze fixed on the fire as he listened. He did not understand all the words, but he understood the music in them, the longing and the sorrow and the beauty. Their arrangement, once a cold contract, had become something else entirely. She was no longer just his cook, and he was no longer just the man who had bought her. They were two people sharing a small space at the edge of the world, their loneliness a little less sharp in the other's company. She still slept on her cot, and he in his bed, but the distance between them felt smaller with each passing day. But spring thaws more than just the earth. It uncovers things that have been buried, things that are sometimes better left in the frozen dark. One afternoon, Luke returned from a trip to town with a wagon full of supplies and a week-old newspaper from Helena. It was a rare treat, a link to the world beyond their ridge. That evening, after the chores were done, Clara sat at the table, smoothing out the rumpled pages, hungry for news. She read of politics in Washington, of cattle prices, of a train derailment back east. And then she saw it, a small article, tucked away at the bottom of the third page. It was only a few lines long, but the words leaped off the page and seized the breath in her lungs. The heading was stark: "Notorious Outlaw Escapes Deer Lodge Prison." She did not need to read the name. She knew it, but her eyes found it anyway. And the sight of the printed letters made her feel as if a hand of ice had closed around her heart. Jedediah Reeves. The tin coffee cup she was holding slipped from her fingers, clattering against the wooden floor and splashing its dark contents in a spreading stain. Luke was by the fireplace, oiling a piece of tack, but the sound made him look up instantly. He saw her face, the blood drained from it, her eyes wide with a terror so profound it was like a physical blow. He saw her hand, trembling, pointing at the newspaper. He was across the room in 3 long strides. "Clara, what is it?" It was the first time he had used her given name. She could not speak. She could only point. He picked up the paper, his eyes scanning the page, and found the article. He read it, his expression hardening. "Jedediah Reeves," he said, the name a low growl in his throat. "A thief and a killer. What is this man to you?" She looked at him, at his strong, worried face, and knew that the time for fragments and half-truths was over. The lie of omission she had been living was no longer a shield. It was a cage, and the monster was rattling the bars. "He is the reason I am here," she whispered, her voice a raw, broken thing. She sank into a chair, her body trembling. "He is the son of the judge I told you about, the powerful man from Boston." Luke pulled the other chair close and sat, his knees almost touching hers. He waited, his patience a solid, comforting presence in her swirling terror. "The story I told you, it was true," she began, her gaze fixed on the dark coffee stain on the floor. "But it was not the whole truth." She took a deep, shuddering breath. "Reeves. He did not just make advances. One evening, my parents were away. He came to the house. He was drunk. He would not take no for an answer." She finally looked up, her eyes pleading with him to understand the things she could not say. "He tore my dress. He hurt me." The words were barely audible. Ghosts of a shame she had carried in silence for so long. "I fought him. I screamed. The servants came running. They pulled him off me." "And you went to the law," Luke said, his voice flat and dangerous. She gave a bitter, tearless laugh. "His father was the law. The next day, I was the one who was arrested. For lewd conduct, for enticing him. He claimed I had invited him, then tried to blackmail him, and they believed him. Of course they believed him. A Reeves of Boston. Who was I? The daughter of a merchant. They put me in jail," she whispered, the memory making her wrap her arms around herself. "For a month. And then the hearing, the judge, his own father, presiding. It was a farce. I was condemned. My name, my family's name, was dragged through the mud." She stopped. The next part, the most difficult of all. "They have a law back there. For fallen women. They call it women with no family to support them. No prospects. The court can assign them to a workhouse or to a private citizen. Indentured servitude. It is a kind of slavery." Her voice broke. "The judge was going to have me sent to a factory in Lowell. 10 years. I would have been gone, owned. That is when I ran. The ticket for the train, the letter to you. It was not an escape from shame. Luke, it was an escape from a cage." She was crying now, silent tears of remembered terror and injustice. Luke reached out, his rough hand covering hers where it lay clenched on the table. His touch was firm, grounding. He looked back at the newspaper, his eyes narrowing. He read the description. 6 feet tall, dark hair, a scar above his left eye from a knife fight. He looked up, his gaze locking with hers. "I have seen this man, before the last snow." He passed through 3 forks, asking questions about newcomers. The blood in Clara's veins turned to ice. He was not just an escapee from a distant prison. He was here. He had been looking for her. The atmosphere in the cabin changed in an instant. The soft, thawing peace was gone, replaced by the cold, hard tension of a fortress under siege. Luke became a different man, the quiet rancher replaced by the soldier he had once been. His movements became sharp, precise, his eyes constantly scanning the tree line around the cabin. That night, he bolted the door and wedged a thick piece of wood under the latch. He took his rifle from the pegs on the wall, cleaned and loaded it with a deadly efficiency, and leaned it against the wall by his bed. He would not sleep in the barn again. He would not sleep outside. He slept on his own bed, a loaded weapon within arm's reach, a silent guardian in the darkness. The news of Reeves's escape and his presence in the territory spread through the valley like a contagion. But the fear it generated did not create sympathy for Clara. It did the opposite. It made her a pariah. She was the source of the trouble, the disease that had infected their quiet community. The whispers in town grew crueler. Mrs. Hale, her face a mask of vindictive piety, confronted them outside the general store. "I heard about that animal Reeves," she said, her voice carrying to the small group of listeners that had gathered. "And I heard who he is looking for." She fixed her sharp gaze on Clara. "You have brought this danger to our doorstep. You are a danger to this community, to our children. A woman of your character attracts trouble like a magnet." The preacher, who was standing with his wife, stepped forward, his face grim. "The Lord cannot bless a sham marriage. Miller," he said, his voice booming with self-righteous authority. "You live in a house built on deceit. You cannot expect the protection of God when you flout His laws." Clara felt a familiar hot flush of shame, but then something else rose up to meet it. A cold, hard anger. She had been silent in Boston, and it had cost her everything. She would not be silent again. She stepped away from Luke's side to face the preacher directly. "God, preacher," she said, her voice low but carrying with a startling clarity. "Sees deeper than a piece of paper signed in a courthouse. He sees what is in a person's heart. Perhaps you should try doing the same." The preacher was so taken aback by her audacity that he was rendered speechless. Clara held his gaze for a moment longer before turning her back on him, on all of them, and walking toward the wagon. The ride home was tense. The confrontation had laid bare the precariousness of their situation. Luke was silent for a long time, his jaw tight, his eyes on the road. "He is right about one thing," he said finally, his voice rough. "It is a sham marriage." He glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "We could make it legal. Ride over to the next county, see a justice of the peace. It would give you my name. Properly, it would give you protection, under the law." Clara's heart clenched. Protection. He was offering her protection. He was a good man, an honorable man. He was offering her the one thing she had so desperately needed in Boston. But her heart rebelled against it. She looked at him, at his strong profile, at the worry etched around his eyes. She wanted so much more from him than protection. "I do not want your protection, Luke," she said softly. He looked at her, confused. "What are you talking about? Reeves is out there. The town is turning on you. You need—" "I do not want to be a duty," she interrupted, her voice trembling with the force of her conviction. "I do not want to be a burden you feel obligated to protect because you signed a piece of paper. I have spent my whole life being what other people wanted me to be. A daughter, a lady, a victim, a fallen woman. For once, I want a real choice, a choice that is mine." He was silent for the rest of the journey, a deep furrow in his brow. He did not understand. She was turning down the very thing that could save her. That night, the air in the cabin was thick with unspoken words. They ate their meal in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. After they had finished, Luke stood by the fire, his back to her, staring into the flames. "I do not think you understand," he said, his voice low and heavy. He turned to face her, and the look in his eyes was one of raw, unguarded emotion, a look she had never seen before. "This is not about duty. Clara, this is not about protection." He took a step toward her, then another, until he was standing before her, so close she could feel the heat from his body. "When I sent for a wife, I wanted quiet. I wanted a woman who would cook my meals and keep my house and not ask anything of me. I wanted to be left alone with my ghosts." His voice dropped to a near whisper. "But you are not quiet. You are full of fire and poetry and a strength I have never seen. You have filled this empty place with life. You have faced down my ghosts. You have faced down your own. I do not want to protect you because I have to. I want you. All of you. The quiet parts and the angry parts and the sad parts. I want to make our marriage legal because I want you to be my wife. Truly. But I will only do it if you choose it for yourself. If you choose me." The truth of his words, the sheer, breathtaking vulnerability of them, shattered the last of her defenses. He was not offering her a shield. He was offering her his heart. He was giving her back the one thing that had been stolen from her, the right to choose her own fate. Tears welled in her eyes, but they were not tears of sadness or fear. They were tears of profound, overwhelming relief. "Oh, Luke," she breathed. And then she rose up on her toes and she kissed him. It was not a gentle kiss. It was fierce, desperate, a kiss full of all the words she could not say. It was a kiss of gratitude, of longing, of a hope she had thought was long dead. She poured all of her pain and all of her fight and all of her newfound strength into it. When she finally pulled away, she rested her forehead against his, their breath mingling in the small space between them. "I am choosing this," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I am choosing you, not because I have to, because I want to." He gathered her into his arms, his hold both powerful and gentle, as if he were holding something infinitely precious. He led her not to her cot, but to his bed. The firelight cast flickering shadows on the rough log walls as he slowly, tentatively, began to undress her. She, in turn, unbuttoned his shirt, her fingers tracing the scars on his chest, each one a testament to the battles he had fought, both in the war and within himself. They made love for the first time, not with a frantic, desperate passion, but with a slow, trembling reverence. It was a hesitant exploration of two scarred landscapes, a quiet mapping of old wounds. There were tears, for the pain they had both endured alone. There was soft laughter, at their own awkwardness and the sheer, impossible joy of it all. There was the silent acknowledgement of scars, both visible and invisible, accepted and honored. And underneath it all, there was hope, a fragile, brilliant seed planted in the dead of winter, now, finally, impossibly, beginning to bloom. They came together not as two broken halves, but as two whole, wounded people, choosing to make something sacred out of the wreckage of their lives. Later, wrapped in the warmth of the blankets and each other, they lay in the quiet darkness, listening to the crackle of the fire and the sound of their own breathing. For the first time since she had stepped off the train, Clara felt safe. She felt home. But outside, beyond the warm circle of the firelight, in the deep, silent shadows of the pine trees at the edge of the clearing, a lone rider sat motionless on his horse. He watched the soft, golden light that spilled from the cabin window, his face a mask of cold, patient hatred. He watched, and he waited. The fragile peace they had built was as delicate and as beautiful as a spider's web in the morning dew, and just as easily torn. For a few weeks, as the valley awakened from its long winter sleep, they lived in a quiet bubble of shared discovery. They were learning the landscape of each other, the hidden sorrows and the surprising strengths. But the world outside their ridge did not care for their tentative happiness. The world had teeth. It began with a pillar of greasy black smoke rising against the clear blue sky to the east. Luke saw it first, his body going rigid as he stood by the corral. It was in the direction of the Hale property. By the time he and two other ranchers arrived, the barn was a roaring inferno. The panicked screams of the animals trapped inside a sound of pure horror. They managed to save the house, but the barn and everything in it was lost. Mrs. Hale stood amidst the chaos, her severe face streaked with soot and tears, her harsh certainty replaced by a stunned, trembling fear. No one knew how the fire had started. A week later, a rancher named Peterson, who lived on the other side of Three Forks, was found in his field. He had been shot from a distance, a single bullet through his back. He was not robbed. His horse was still there, grazing peacefully nearby. It was an execution, cold and without reason. Fear, a sickness far more virulent than any winter flu, spread through the valley. It poisoned the new spring air. Locks were bolted at night. Men rode with rifles across their saddles, their eyes constantly scanning the ridges. The fear needed a name, and it had one, Reeves. But the fear also needed a face, a source, a reason for its presence. And for that, the town turned to Clara. The whispers that had once been sharp were now laced with genuine terror. She was the lightning rod that had drawn the storm, the burned barn, the dead man. That was her fault. The danger they all felt was her shadow, cast long and dark over all of them. Luke saw the change in their faces, heard the change in their tone. He began to carry a rifle everywhere, his easy, rolling gait replaced by a watchful tension. He was a soldier again. The peace he had found in the mountains had been a fleeting dream. One afternoon, he came to Clara where she was tending a small patch of earth she had cleared for a garden. He carried a Winchester rifle in one hand and a small, heavy pistol in the other. He said nothing, simply stood there until she looked up, her hands covered in rich, dark soil. "You need to learn," he said, his voice flat. "I cannot be with you every second of the day. You need to know how to protect yourself." She looked at the guns, at the cold, hard metal that was so alien to her. The very idea was terrifying, but the memory of Reeves's face, the fear of being helpless again, was more terrifying still. She wiped her hands on her apron and nodded. He started her with the rifle. He showed her how to hold it, how to brace its stock against the soft part of her shoulder. He showed her how to sight down the long barrel, to line up the front and rear sights on a target, a tin can he had placed on a distant fence post. His hands were gentle and sure as he adjusted her stance, his voice a low, steady murmur in her ear. The proximity of him, the smell of leather and pine smoke was a comfort, but the cold weight of the rifle in her hands was a stark reminder of the danger that necessitated this lesson. "Breathe out slow," he instructed, "and do not jerk the trigger. Squeeze it, gentle, like you are afraid of breaking it." She took a breath, the metallic smell of the rifle filling her senses. She lined up the sights, the small can seeming to waver in the distance. She thought of Reeves, of his sneering mouth and the coldness in his eyes. She thought of the preacher's wife, of Mrs. Hale, of all the faces that had looked at her with contempt. A cold fury, an emotion she had not known she was capable of, settled in her belly. Her hand grew steady. The wavering stopped. She squeezed the trigger. The explosion was a deafening crack that seemed to split the air. The rifle kicked back against her shoulder with a brutal, surprising force, knocking her back a step. But 100 yards away, the tin can leaped from the fence post and spun into the air. She stood, stunned, her shoulder throbbing, her ears ringing. Luke was staring at her, his mouth slightly agape. He had not expected that, neither had she. "Again," he said, a new note of respect in his voice. They practiced for an hour every day. She learned the pistol too, the weapon's sharp bark a contrast to the rifle's deeper roar. And she was a natural. Her determination was a hard, cold thing. Her aim, once she learned to control her breathing, was unnervingly steady. Luke watched her, a mixture of pride and deep, gut-wrenching fear in his heart. He was proud of her strength, her adaptability. But the fact that she needed this skill at all was a constant, aching reminder of how fragile their world had become. He was not just teaching her to shoot. He was teaching her to kill. And he was doing it because he was terrified of losing her. Their nights changed. Sleep became a luxury they could not afford. They took turns keeping watch, one of them sitting by the single window with the rifle across their lap while the other slept a fitful, shallow sleep. The watches were long and silent, marked only by the hoot of an owl or the distant cry of a coyote. They would share a mug of hot, black coffee during the handover, their hands brushing in the dim light, a small, fleeting moment of connection in the tense darkness. The fragile peace they had built, the intimacy they had just begun to explore, now felt like a thread stretched to its breaking point. One loud noise, one shadow moving in the moonlight, and it would snap. One afternoon, while Luke was out checking the fences on the far side of the property, Clara went to her cot. She reached under the mattress and pulled out the small, hidden stack of letters she had written, the letters to no one. She sat by the stove and read them, one by one. They were the words of a different person, a frightened, lonely woman clinging to the ghost of a life that was gone forever. They were full of fear, of uncertainty, of a deep and abiding shame. She looked at the words on the page, the elegant script of a Boston lady, and felt a profound disconnect. That person was not her anymore. That person would not have been able to hit a tin can from 100 yards. That person would have crumbled under the weight of the town's scorn. With a sudden, fierce resolve, she took the letters to the stove. She opened the small iron door and, one by one, fed them to the flames. She watched as the paper curled, blackened, and turned to ash. It was a funeral. She was burying the woman she had been. Then, she took a fresh sheet of paper and her pen, in a hand that was now steadier, less ornate. She wrote a new letter. It was short, only a few lines. My name is Clara Miller. My home is on a ridge in the Gallatin Valley. I was a victim. Then I was a survivor. Now, I am a wife and a fighter. This is who I am now, and I am not running anymore. She did not hide this letter. She folded it and placed it in the book of poetry by her bedside. A declaration, a promise to herself. The breaking point came 2 days later. A rider from a neighboring ranch came pounding up the path to their cabin, his horse lathered in sweat, his face pale with panic. "It is the preacher's girl," he gasped, sliding from his horse. "Sarah! She is gone! The preacher went to town to get the sheriff. He found a note on the door. It was from Reeves." Luke grabbed the man by the shoulders. "What did the note say?" The man swallowed hard. It said he has the girl, and he will trade her for the woman from Boston. He wants Mrs. Miller to meet him, alone, in the saloon in Three Forks, at sundown. Clara, who had come to the door, felt the world tilt on its axis. He had taken a child, a sweet, innocent girl she had seen in town, with bright ribbons in her hair. He was using a child to bait her, to draw her out into the open. It was a move of such monstrous cruelty that it stole the air from her lungs. "No," Luke said, his voice a low, deadly snarl. He looked at Clara, his face a mask of fierce, absolute refusal. "Absolutely not. We will bar the door. The whole town can go to hell. I will not let you go." "Luke, he has a little girl," she pleaded, her heart aching for the preacher and his wife, the very people who had scorned her. "This is not your fight," he shot back, his fear making his voice harsh. "This is my fight. I will go down there. I will deal with Reeves." "And what will happen to Sarah, then?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. "He will kill her the second he sees you. You know that. He does not want you. He wants me. This started with me, and it has to end with me." "I will not lose you," he roared, the words torn from him, a cry of raw, terrified love. She stepped closer to him, placing her hands on his chest, feeling the frantic, desperate beating of his heart. She looked up into his face, into the storm of fear and rage in his eyes, and she spoke with a calm she did not feel. "Luke, look at me." She waited until his eyes focused on hers. "Do you remember the woman who stepped off that train? The woman who was afraid of her own shadow? The woman who flinched if you came too close?" He nodded, his throat working. "I am not that woman anymore," she said, her voice soft but unbreakable. "You did that. You did not try to fix me. You did not pity me. You stood back and you let me find my own footing. You showed me what strength was, not by telling me, but by being it. You gave me strength. Luke, please, let me use it." He stared at her, his internal battle raging on his face. He saw the woman before him, the steady gaze, the firm set of her jaw. She was right. She was not the same woman. She was a force. To deny her this, to lock her away for her own safety, would be to break the very spirit he had come to love. It would be to turn her back into the victim she had fought so hard to stop being. Slowly, the fight went out of his eyes, replaced by a grim, reluctant acceptance. He closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them, his decision was made. "We go together," he said, his voice hoarse, "side by side." They rode into Three Forks as the sun was beginning to dip below the western peaks, painting the sky in fiery streaks of orange and purple. They rode not as a rancher and his mail-order bride, not as a broken man and a bought woman, but as partners, equals. two solitary figures moving as one toward a shared destiny. The town was eerily silent. Doors were shut, windows shuttered. The people were hiding, leaving the woman they had condemned to face the monster alone. They dismounted in front of the saloon, the swinging doors hanging open like the mouth of a dark cave. Luke handed her the pistol. Their eyes met. No words were needed. He squeezed her hand, a hard, quick gesture of reassurance, and then he moved away, disappearing into the shadows of the alley beside the blacksmith's shop, seeking a vantage point. Clara took a deep breath, her hand closing around the cool, heavy grip of the pistol in her coat pocket. She was alone. She walked across the dusty street, her boots making no sound, and stepped through the swinging doors. The saloon was dim, smelling of stale beer and fear. Reeves was there, sitting at a table in the center of the room, the preacher's daughter. Sarah was tied to a chair beside him, her eyes wide with terror, a dirty rag stuffed in her mouth as a gag. Reeves had a bottle of whiskey and a glass in front of him, and a long-barreled revolver lay on the table, inches from his hand. He smiled when he saw Clara, a slow, predatory smile that did not reach his cold eyes. "Clara Fairchild," he drawled, his voice a mockery of Boston civility. "I knew you would come. You always did have a misplaced sense of honor." "Let the girl go, Jedediah," Clara said, her voice steady, betraying none of the terror that was screaming inside her. She stopped in the middle of the room, a good 20 feet from him. "All in good time," he sneered. He leaned back in his chair, enjoying his power. "Look at you, playing the frontiersman's wife, dressed in homespun cloth, with dirt under your fingernails. It is quite a fall from grace, is it not? From the parlors of Beacon Hill to a log cabin at the end of the world. With him." He spat the last word out like a curse. "This is a better life than any you could have offered me," she replied, her voice cold. His smile vanished. "You ruined me. You know, my father, he never forgave the scandal. He sent me west to disappear. And now, you will disappear." He was trying to frighten her, to make her feel small and helpless again. And it was almost working. But then she remembered the letters, the fire, the promise she had made to herself. She was not Clara Fairchild anymore. "You think you are so powerful," she said, her voice taking on a new, cutting edge. "But you are just a coward. You always have been. You attack women and children because you are afraid to face a real man. Your father knew it. That is why he sent you away. He was ashamed of his weak, pathetic son." His face darkened with rage. He was not used to being challenged. "You shut your mouth," he hissed, his hand moving toward the gun on the table. "Does it hurt?" she pressed, taking a small step forward, her mind racing, searching for a way, an opening. "Knowing that even with all your money and your name, you are nothing but a disappointment." She remembered the spilled coffee on the floor of the cabin, the moment her world had tilted. The memory gave her an idea. With a sudden, deliberate movement, she kicked over a small, empty table nearby. The clatter of it hitting the floor was just the distraction she needed. It was a fraction of a second, but it was enough. Reeves's eyes flickered to the sound, his instincts momentarily overriding his focus on her. In that instant, the window of the saloon exploded inward as Luke fired the rifle. The shot went wide, meant to startle, not to kill, and slammed into the wall behind the bar. Reeves roared with rage, grabbing his revolver from the table and firing a wild shot toward the window. The saloon erupted into a deafening chaos of gunfire and shattering glass. Luke fired again, and this time, Reeves cried out, clutching his arm as blood blossomed on his sleeve. But Reeves was a cornered rat, and cornered rats are dangerous. He fired back into the alley, and Clara heard Luke cry out in pain, a sound that tore through her heart. Reeves turned his gun on her, a triumphant, hateful leer on his face. But in his haste, he had forgotten the girl. Sarah, terrified but resourceful. kicked her chair backward, toppling them both to the floor in a tangle of limbs. That was the opening. Clara pulled the pistol from her pocket, her hands surprisingly steady. Reeves was scrambling to his feet, trying to aim. She did not hesitate. She fired. The pistol bucked in her hand. Reeves staggered back, a look of shocked surprise on his face, a dark stain spreading on his chest. He looked down at the wound, then up at her, his mouth opening. And then he crashed to the floor and was still. Silence. A profound, ringing silence filled the saloon, broken only by the whimpering of the little girl and a low groan from the alley outside. Clara rushed to Luke. He was slumped against the wall, his face pale, his hand pressed to his side, where blood was soaking his shirt. "Luke!" she cried, dropping to her knees beside him. "I am all right," he gritted out, though his face was tight with pain. Suddenly, the sound of running footsteps echoed in the street. The town sheriff, a portly, mustachioed man, appeared at the mouth of the alley, his gun drawn, followed by the preacher and a handful of other men. They stopped, taking in the scene, the dead man in the saloon, the crying girl, Clara kneeling beside a wounded Luke, a smoking pistol still clutched in her hand. The entire town seemed to hold its breath. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy. Clara looked up, meeting their wide, stunned eyes. She had done it. She had faced the monster and won. Then, a single, strange sound broke the stillness. It was the sound of one person clapping, the preacher. He was looking at his daughter, who was now being untied by the sheriff. And then at Clara, his face a mixture of awe and profound gratitude. Then the sheriff started clapping, a slow, steady beat. And then another man, and another. Soon, the street was filled with the sound of applause, a slow, rolling wave of respect for the woman they had once scorned, the woman who had just saved them all. The gunshot had been the last violent sound of their old lives. The silence that followed was not empty, but filled with a new and unfamiliar peace. Luke's wound was a deep and ugly thing, a furrow plowed in the muscle of his side by Reeves's desperate, dying rage. The doctor from the next county over, a grim man with whiskey on his breath, cleaned it, stitched it, and declared that Luke was lucky to be alive. The bullet had passed clean through, but it had torn through him in a way that would leave its mark forever. He survived, but survival, as they both knew, came at a cost. The long, slow process of healing began. Clara nursed him again, but this time, the world was different. The cabin was no longer a silent prison of two strangers, but a sanctuary. The first time she had tended to his wounds, her hands had trembled with fear and uncertainty, her every movement dictated by a cold, clinical necessity. Now, her hands were steady with a purpose born of love. She changed his bandages with a gentle, practiced touch. She bathed his feverish brow with cool water. She cooked him nourishing broths and coaxed him to eat, her voice a low, encouraging murmur. But this time, her care was punctuated by kisses pressed softly to his forehead, to his rough, unshaven cheek. This time, the silence was filled with jokes, soft and sometimes silly, designed to coax a pained smile from his lips. "You are a terrible patient," she would tease, as he tried to sit up for the 10th time in an hour. "Worse than a bear with a thorn in its paw." "And you," he would rasp, his hand finding hers and holding it tight, "are a bossy, stubborn woman from Boston." "And do not you forget it," she would reply, her smile bright. The pain was a constant, sullen presence, and in the long nights when it kept him from sleep, she would sit by his bed, holding his hand, and read to him from her book of poetry until his breathing evened out and his grip on her fingers relaxed. In those quiet, lamp-lit hours, she watched the hard lines of his face soften, the soldier receding, leaving only the man she loved. As his body healed, a permanent limp settled into his gait. It was a slight thing, a subtle hesitation in his left leg, but it was a constant reminder of the day she had faced death in the saloon. He would never again move with the same easy, powerful grace. It was a new scar, another chapter in the story of his life written on his body. But unlike the others, this was one they shared. While Luke healed inside the cabin, Clara's reputation was healing outside of it. The town of Three Forks, which had once been a source of such profound humiliation, began to look at her with a new, quiet respect. The story of the showdown in the saloon had become an instant legend, told and retold over whiskeys at the bar and over fences between neighbors. The details grew with each telling, but the core of it remained the same, the quiet. Mail-order bride had faced down a killer when all the men were hiding, and she had saved the preacher's little girl. People who had once crossed the street to avoid her now offered a shy, respectful nod when she passed. Mr. Henderson at the general store saved the freshest eggs for her. The women, who had once whispered behind their hands, now met her eyes with a look of frank, undisguised admiration. One afternoon, the preacher himself rode all the way out to their cabin. He stood on their doorstep, his hat in his hands, his face a study in humility and gratitude. Mrs. Miller, he began. His booming voice softened. My wife and I, we owe you a debt we can never repay. You saved our Sarah. You were brave when I was not. He looked down at his hat, unable to meet her gaze. I said some things, judged you harshly. I was wrong. I was a fool, blinded by my own pride. I hope in time you can find it in your heart to forgive me. Clara looked at this man, who had been the voice of her public condemnation, and she felt no triumph, only a quiet, weary empathy. There is nothing to forgive. Preacher, she said softly, we all did what we thought was right. The most surprising visitor came a week later. A wagon rumbled up the path, and from it descended Mrs. Hale, dressed in her severe black, but carrying something in her hands, wrapped in a clean linen cloth. She marched to the door with her usual stern demeanor, but her eyes, when she looked at Clara, held a new and uncertain light. I heard your husband was on the mend, she said, her voice stiff, as if the words were uncomfortable in her mouth. She thrust the bundle toward Clara. I baked a pie. Apple. Clara was so stunned she could only take it, the warmth of the dish seeping through the cloth into her hands. What happened at our place? The fire. Mrs. Hale faltered, her iron composure cracking for a moment. That could have been us. That could have been my children. You put a stop to it. You faced him? She took a deep breath. This valley is a hard place. We need good, strong people in it. I was mistaken about you. Mrs. Miller. It was the closest the proud, rigid woman could come to an apology, and Clara understood its weight. Thank you, Mrs. Hale, she said, her voice genuine. Please, call me Clara. A flicker of a smile, as rare and as welcome as a winter rose, touched Mrs. Hale's lips. She nodded once, turned, and marched back to her wagon, her duty done. Clara stood in the doorway, holding the warm pie, and felt the last tight knot of her old shame finally, completely, unravel. She was no longer an outcast. She was a neighbor. When Luke was well enough to ride again, they made their marriage legal. But they did not go to the preacher's church. They did not ride to the next county to find a justice of the peace. The laws of men, the pieces of paper and the public ceremonies, had failed Clara once before. She had no need of them now. Their vows had already been made, sealed not with ink, but with blood and loyalty and the quiet understanding that had grown between them in the heart of a blizzard. Instead, they rode to the top of the ridge behind their cabin, to a small, wind-swept meadow that looked out over the entire valley. The sky above was a vast, brilliant blue, and the mountains stood around them, silent and eternal witnesses. There, with only the eagles circling high above and the wind whispering through the pines, they made their promises. He took her hands in his grip still strong, his limp forgotten as he stood before her. "I have nothing to offer you, Clara," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "No fine house, no fancy name, just this land, and my heart, which is yours. For as long as I have breath in my body, I promise to stand by you, to fight for you, and to honor the fighter that you are. I choose you, every day, for the rest of my days." Tears streamed down her face, but she was smiling. "And I have nothing to offer you but a past full of trouble and a stubborn spirit," she replied, her voice thick but clear. "But I give you all that I am, all that I was, and all that I will be. I promise to share your burdens, to celebrate your joys, and to build a home with you, right here. My heart is yours. Luke, it has been for longer than I knew. I choose you, today, and all of my tomorrows." He slid a simple, thin band of gold onto her finger. He had traded his father's pocket watch for it, the last relic of his old life, trading a memory of the past for a promise of the future. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. Life settled into a new rhythm, the peaceful, steady rhythm of the seasons. The fear was gone, replaced by the simple, profound work of building a life together. Luke, with his new, thoughtful gait, added a porch to the front of the cabin, a place for them to sit in the evenings, and in the center of it, he hung a swing he had built from smooth-planed pine, wide enough for two. Clara, in turn, brought her own brand of life to the rugged homestead. She planted wildflowers along the path to the door, lupine and fireweed and Indian paintbrush. Their bright, defiant colors were a splash of impossible beauty against the harsh landscape, a testament to the fact that even in the hardest soil, lovely things could grow. Her world expanded beyond the ridge. The children of the valley, who had once been taught to fear her, now flocked to her. She had a way with them, a quiet patience and a love of learning that they found irresistible. She started a small, informal school in her own cabin 2 afternoons a week, teaching the neighbors' girls, and then their brothers, how to read and write. She taught them not just their letters, but the poetry she loved, filling their heads with beauty and wonder. She, who had once been a pariah, had become the heart of the community. The seasons turned. The vibrant green of spring gave way to the deep, sun-drenched green of summer, and then to the brilliant gold of the aspens in the fall. The nights grew crisp and cool, and the sky, on a moonless night, was a breathtaking spill of diamond dust, so close it felt as if you could reach up and touch it. One such night, they sat together on the porch swing he had built, a thick quilt wrapped around them. The air was still and cold, and the only sounds were the gentle creak of the swing and the distant, lonely cry of a wolf. They sat in a comfortable silence, watching the stars. Clara leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the solid, steady warmth of him. She thought of the long journey that had brought her here, of the fear and the shame and the loneliness. She thought of the woman she had been, a fragile thing, nearly broken by the world, and she looked at the man beside her, the man whose own brokenness had made a space for hers. "You saved me," she whispered into the vast, starry silence. She felt his arm tighten around her. "When I came here, I was running for my life. You gave me a place to hide. You saved me." She paused, lifting her head to look at him, her eyes shining in the starlight. "But more than that, you let me save myself." A slow smile spread across his face, crinkling the corners of his eyes. The scars, the limp, the ghosts, they were all still there, a part of him, but they no longer defined him. Love had filled in the cracks. He leaned in, his smile turning teasing. "And you lied to me," he murmured, his voice a low, playful rumble. "Right from the very start. not to be touched. You said. She smirked, a spark of mischief dancing in her eyes. She pressed a slow, deliberate kiss to the warm skin of his neck, just below his ear. I will lie again, she whispered, her voice a husky promise. Just wait until tonight. If there had been a camera, it would have pulled back then. Rising high above the small cabin, it would have shown the single point of warm, golden firelight in the immense, dark wilderness, a beacon of impossible warmth in the cold. It would have shown the vast, star-dusted sky and the endless, silent land, and the two souls on the porch, no longer afraid, no longer running, no longer alone. Together, they were no longer haunted by the ghosts of what had been broken. Together, in the heart of the unforgiving West, they had taken all their shattered pieces and made something whole, something new, something sacred. Thank you for joining us around the fire for this tale. We encourage you to comment with where you are listening from to connect with fellow fans of the West. Subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.